My recollection at that time is that, first of all, the centre was much larger than when it started. Not much, but I mean, we had a grouping of 20 students or something like that. Secondly, that the universities were breaking out all over. Yes, there's a huge student movement developing, and that had already begun to be in the States, occupations and sit-ins and so on. And I think, many of the students in Birmingham at the centre thought, well, how do those questions relate to us? I started to read things, started to read Marcuse, who was very strong on the new student movement as an agency of social and political change. And so we got embroiled in a debate about Birmingham. And we got asked to do an issue of the university magazine called
Mermaid.
Mermaid,
Yeah.
in which we addressed the Vice Chancellor about it. Serve with love, it was called. And it was a very interesting document because it wasn't sharp and bitter as those sorts of rows became. It was gentle, but questioning. What sort of university is this? What does it teach? Why do students play such a obedient and negative, quiet role in it? So on. Well, by the time we came to that Christmas, Birmingham had its sit-in, and the occupation was, in that case, motivated by the rise in student fees for external students. And we thought this is, a sign of a very backward place that's not welcoming outside students, that's using the fees to deter their entry rather than encourage it. And this is a sign of a kind of bureaucratized management of the system, which was not open to student influences. We were very influenced by 68 in the sense that we began to think of ourselves as a collective, which in those days everybody was in a collective.
What was your role? I mean, did you have a role in the sit-in? Were you speaking, or did you have more of a distance?
Well, remember that because of the way in which the centre was organised, students and staff were very much together. We couldn't be very separate because we didn't profess a discipline that we could tell them about. We were sort of 2 weeks behind the next text we suggested they read for the general theory course. So that ruptured the normal relationships between teachers and students. But as well as that, wanting to make the place more collectively organised and collectively run meant that we were in constant discussion, continuous discussion with one another. Every centre meeting was another, sort of opening inquiry into where's the university going, what is the politics of cultural studies, how does this affect students, how should we organise our work so it makes sense more in those terms, etc. So all of that is well in play around us before Birmingham students, not the centre directly, but the centre became quickly involved, decided on the issue of student fees, Birmingham owes itself an occupation. And it happened. That's happening elsewhere too. But Birmingham did.
Where was Hybert within this? Because I imagine at that point he was still director.
Oh yes.
Was he treading quite a fine line in a sense between having to maintain an outward position and an...
Yes, he's treading a fine line, so am I. But I'm mainly attached to the centre, whereas he's a professor of English. What's more, he was on the Senate committee. So, he was discussing what to do about the troublesome students who are sitting in the Great Hall while coming back to the centre, where clearly 2 or 3 of the malcontents would be easily identified. So he had a very rough time, I think. And out of the rest of the university gave him beans. Very uncomfortable. And I think, in a way, too uncomfortable for him to stay. They didn't put him out, or, it wasn't a decision like that. But I just think it asked him to operate in an atmosphere which he found so uncomfortable he couldn't go with. A lot of pressure on me too, but then I belong to the centre. Yes, and I was thought to be more political, and I'd edited the Mermaid edition, so they knew my sympathies at any rate. I wasn't organising the sit-in, but my sympathies were on the side of students who were demanding change, and who were questioning, not only demanding organisational change in the university, but also arguing about the organisation of social knowledge. Who gets it? Do you get it by standing still? Do you get it by reading books? Or do you get it by engaging with it? And so on. So it bore down on both of us rather separately. And that's when Richard got his invitation to go to UNESCO for a short time and decided to go. And he's never told me, but I just assumed that he thought it was time for him to be out of the centre of those cross pressures.
How did first Herjeet's departure and then that moment more generally, 1968 moment more generally, what impact did those two things have on the centre's organisation and working practices? Did it lead to a further democratisation of the centre?
Well, that's an embarrassing question. I was made director, acting director, while Herjeet was away for 4 years. But 4 years is 4 years, so the place inevitably took on my intellectual and political and critical interests. I was much more theoretical than Herjeet was. We began the theory seminar in that period. So it was influenced and shaped by the fact that Richard was in Paris and I was in place. I went to see him, reported to him, etc. And I think he could clearly pick up that not through any doing of me against him or anything like that, but the drift was just going away from an old literary cultural interest in the use of literacy. Just wasn't that anymore. What we call the cultural turn was beginning, and that's really what was happening here. This is the impact of culture and its disorganizing effects on a whole range of disciplines, on English, on sociology, on anthropology, on history, on architecture, on a history of art, and so on. So it's a big moment, as it were, in that sense. So the 68 question also led us to initiate more things in the centre. So by the time Herjeet was considering whether he was coming back or not, there were things like weekly general meetings at which everything about the centre was discussed, every single facet of it. People could raise whatever they liked. And because it was a collective, we didn't take particular positions of leadership, so people got more of a say going on. I remember a very important decision I took. We used to use cyclostyle machines, Gestechner machines, you have to roll. And I got some money and I bought a second cyclostyle machine, one for the office and one for the students. And they could write what they liked, what they thought, and distribute it and put it in the pigeonholes, without my say-so. So for right or wrong, good or bad, I abnegated a kind of particular form of academic leadership. I wasn't into it. I didn't think it was right, either for the subject or for the time. So by the time he did consider his time was up and he had to stay for a while on a more permanent basis and give up the centre or come back, the centre had sort of changed out of all recognition. There were many more discussion groups, and that was important because the numbers of students had expanded, so there were more disciplines represented in the student body and more interests. So we had to cater for that. So we allowed groupings of interest to come together and form their own working groups. So here's a general meeting for the centre for organisational purposes. Then there's a general theory seminar, which everybody's going to. Then there are the group meetings and discussions where people are reading more in a more specialist way. The question is, how did anybody get time to do any research? And the truth is, it didn't all that much. But that's what they wanted to do, and that's how the tendency went. It created a phenomenally unique intellectual milieu. I don't know any other milieu like that. I sometimes think, people sometimes talk about the Birmingham School, and they're modelling the phrase after the Frankfurt School. There's nothing like the Frankfurt School. Frankfurt School is full of eminence grise, Habermas and Adorno and illustrious philosophical figures. We didn't have any grand philosophical figures. We were just part of the hoi polloi, trying to find out, trying to get some useful ideas, workable ideas with which we could analyse the trends in contemporary culture. That's what we're trying to do. Well, you asked a question about my position in that, because as you can see, I am playing two roles. As far as the centre is concerned, and the university is concerned, I am a research centre director. I'm responsible to them, for the students, for their supervision, for their theses, for the organisation of their studies. As far as the centre is concerned, I'm in the general meeting speaking like everybody else. I mean, inevitably, because I'm the director, I guess my words may have carried more weight. But it was not so led by the more experienced of us, or the people who were in the South. Not by any means. So the pressures between these two began to be very difficult to sustain. Yes, I could not be a student among students. And I didn't want to be a research director looking after his students. But these are two roles which are very difficult to sustain. I think people in the centre found it difficult. I think they were very sympathetic because they understood that this was emotionally rather testing. So they gave me an easy time of it, though they also didn't give me an easy time when they wanted to.
If you made an intervention, that would be seen as being the director's intervention. And if you didn't make an intervention, it would be seen as being why is Stuart being so quiet?
Yes.
In that sense, you couldn't. Whatever you did,
there was no path. Yes, you were constantly confronted by two ways of doing it. For instance, I'll give you an example, which is a telling one. The students said at one stage, when we announced the theory course readings for the next semester, why isn't there any feminism? Yeah, indeed, you're quite right. Well, what should we read? Juliet Mitchell. Okay, we put Juliet Mitchell. Who else? But some of the French theories. French theories, who are they? Well, let's put them on. Well, I can't introduce that. And that's not my choice. So gradually, they're intervening in the very core of the seminar. They are rewriting the curriculum of the seminar. It's hard to take. You're 10, 15 years older than them. You don't know a lot more about cultural studies, but you sort of feel, well, those ancient feelings assail you. Well, I'm a bit more experienced. I read a few more books than you. Why don't you, listen to what I have to say on this subject rather than just make up your own mind. So I felt tugged. I was constantly tugged between the two poles. And there was a particular area of concern in which that manifested itself, and that was in relation to the political tendencies in the centre. Because when it grew, there were people from all over the political compass. We had a couple of conservatives, we certainly had people from the Labour left, we had communists, we had Trotskyists, the far left, etc. And I wanted all of these tendencies to be perfectly free and open to express their views, hence the cyclostatic machine. But I opposed the idea that the centre itself should belong to or be colonised by any one tendency. It was not a communist centre, not a Trotskyist centre, not a social democratic centre. Okay? The politics were in the intellectual work, not in the colonisation by a tendency outside itself. So you have to bring the critique into the work itself and show justification for why it's there, why it matters, why you're asking that question. You're not asking that question because communist headquarters or somebody else has told you to ask the question, not because you're trying to capture the centre. Well, to be honest, my recollection of it is that most people eventually agreed with that, because they didn't want the centre to deteriorate into just a, slap-bang confrontation between the forces of the left. On the other hand, individual people did think we should be rather more Trotskyist, or rather more communist, or rather more social democratic, or rather more liberal than we were. So there was a debate going on.
What are your memories of that, the moment missed series of debates? And it might be slightly cheeky to throw that at you, considering it was 40 years ago. But
well,
as I understand it, it was about the transition from this notion of a relatively tight collective to a looser collective.
Yes, there's a transition from a tight collective to a looser collective. You can't recruit students from all over Britain, by a normal process of recruitment, and expect them to form a tight collective. The days of tight collectives belonged with 5 students, Richard and me, in a room. The moment of 20 students in a room and lots of people coming to the centre who didn't formally belong at all, but slipped up to Birmingham to hear one seminar or another, forming a tight collective was not on. So we did loosen the notion of the collective. One of the ways in which we did that was to give more power to the individual groupings. They could have projects of their own, as it were. And therefore to take a bit of the weight away from the general centre meeting and the theory seminar. Those were the sort of central collective points of organisation in the week. But people could get more and more involved in the literature around their particular areas of concern. So gradually the idea of a collective, a tight collective, couldn't be sustained. And I didn't want it really. As far as I'm accurate in thinking about what I wanted at that time, I didn't want it to be an accurate collective. On the other hand, this did mean that there were many tendencies going in the centre. And I thought, in some respects, opportunities were being missed. And that was what I thought the missed moment was.
That in terms of this notion of the creation of a collective or advanced base within the university where territory could be reclaimed from the dominant mode of knowledge and authority.
No.
Is that like the moment that was kind of...
Yeah, I mean, that's the moment when that was reinforced. I think from the moment we knew we were opening a centre in a field which was not a discipline and had no curriculum, that we were engaged in an exercise counter to the current organisation of knowledge, the link between knowledge and power, which shaped the university material. We were obviously at odds with that, working in a different kind of way, in a different direction. And by the time you get to the moment you're talking about, that's perfectly obvious. And so the question is, how are we to assess exactly how we should behave in such a situation? What were we to do if we were trying to challenge the map of knowledge which universities were there to transmit? That's their formal purpose. Transmit knowledge, usually the knowledge of the traditional scholars. But now you're not transmitting that, you're forming a kind of breakaway group inside that. And I thought that needed a lot more thought, because we couldn't declare a republic, the Republic of the Centre of Cultural Studies. But we clearly was not going along the groove of other fields. There was a lot of talk in those days about establishing a red base Ours was not a red base like that. But if you ask me, did it establish a bridgehead, and work out some of the modes of organisation and study and writing? It did. Yes, it did. And the fact that after that, cultural studies took fire all over the world, is a sense that its very counter properties were what other people were looking for. There was a crisis of traditional knowledge in the social sciences and the humanities. Yes? And we later came to call that the cultural turn. But the Centre is one of the first examples of trying to organise the cultural turn as a sort of quasi-institution inside a university hostile to its overall purposes.
Do you think identity politics arrived within the Centre?
Well, I would say identity politics are, they're sort of on the agenda earlier on because there's a lot of movement towards community politics. Yes, politics from below. People had lost their faith in political parties, political tendencies, but they wanted to engage ordinary folk in taking command of their own lives or thinking out what sort of things they wanted to do. But I think it's really with two factors that identity politics comes into existence. One is around race and the other is around feminism. Because this is a claim made in relation to a category of social being. Yes, it doesn't say you must do this because that's my political program. You're saying you must do this because this is what I am. I make this claim in the name of being black, which is a category which has been despised and etc., overruled by the West for centuries. Or I do this in the name of the women's cause, whom patriarchy has bossed and throughout the centuries. So I think that's when the question of who are you suddenly comes to the fore, or gradually comes to the fore. I don't know, it suddenly comes, gradually comes to the fore. And it begins to intervene in the more traditional field of politics, so that it becomes the organising centre of a number of political movements, rather than they being given by the old political agendas. Well, I'd say one thing that might be of interest to you at this point. I was in a very particular place in relation to that, because I didn't think that identity could be all of it, yes? Because there are lots of unprogressive, reactionary black people. So to say, this is made in the name of the black nations, or some of it, and some of it is, and some of it isn't. Secondly, I was myself in a quandary about the question, because my whole social formation had led me exactly to this unresolved point: who are you? Who are you? Where are you from? This would require me to say a bit more about my formation and the early stages. I was born in a middle-class Jamaican, brown middle-class Jamaican home, family. My mother belonged to a small planter class, or was adopted into it. My father was a lower middle-class boy. They wanted me to be a good middle-class Jamaican boy. They wanted me to be clever, win the plaudits, go into law, become when the colonial regime eventually go, we would be the bosses, as has indeed happened. I couldn't stand it in there. In that milieu, I could not bear it. I didn't like their attitudes. I didn't identify with who they wanted me to be. I didn't identify with how they saw me. I was darker than most of them. I thought, why should that matter? It does matter, because they despised, or certainly looked down on, the broad mass of ordinary black Jamaicans. So I gradually distanced myself from that social location. When you distance yourself from social location, where do you go? I'm still a schoolboy, I'm still living there. Well, where do you turn? Well, of course you turn to the people that are being left out. But how does a young, brown, middle-class Jamaican boy take on the black Jamaican vernacular? It was as strange to me as I know about it because Jamaica is a small place. I know lots about it. I know everything about it. But I'm not one of it anymore, either. So who am I? And I resolved that problem partly by leaving. I decided not to stay at home and study, but to come abroad to study. Because I thought Jamaica is a very provincial place. You are not going to solve this question of where you stand in it in a very easy way. Go somewhere else, encounter new things, and think about it. Well, I decided eventually not to go home. I say that only because I wanted you to know that when identity politics arise, they hit very, tillable soil. Yes, I'm sort of waiting for this question to come up in a broader way. I'd already confronted it because when I came to England, brought by my mother in August 1951, to go to Merton College, Oxford, with a huge steamer trunk, which I never went into after she placed it in the basement of Merton College. I walked around the corner from where we were staying, past Paddington Station, and there were all these ordinary Jamaicans. Perfectly ordinary working class Jamaican men and women in their felt hats, and they're dressed up to the nines, and they're shivering in their cottons and their straw baskets, sitting. And I thought, where were they from? I thought I'd safely left them all behind. Now they're going to come and trouble me here. And I'd think that, but I know, what is their prospect? Are they going to make a life? Are the English going to accept them? Will they retain their old culture? Will they take on a new culture? So the cultural question arises for me, and the identity question, long before the Centre for Cultural Studies, or feminism, or black, the black movement.
It's also happening outside of the centre, before it arrives in the centre as well. I mean, the women's movement, women's liberation comes out of 1968.
Oh yes.
And it takes a while for it to come in
to
the centre, even though people like Ross Brunt were active in various women's groups in the early 70s.
Yes, well they're active there are women who are active in feminist groups. And that was, we approved of that, etc. It comes in partly as a result of that in terms of recruitment. We wanted to get somebody in who could take charge of this area more. We thought, get a feminist academic. We didn't have any money to pay them, but they might be willing to, help us decide how to build this into the centre. We didn't manage it. But not long after that, we started to recruit women who were active feminists. An active feminist element came into the centre. So it was really through recruitment rather than through our individual activities. Some people were in both places, but a lot of people began to drift towards the centre because it seemed to be asking relevant questions about their political and identity problems. So then it's another phase. The phase now is how to represent this new set of interests within the field that we've been defining as cultural studies. And that's when a lot of the tensions arose.
So given what you just said about your own formations and identity and those questions that were, of course, already very much at the forefront of your mind, in a sense it was an open door for
Yes, it's very much at the forefront of mine, very much an open door. On the other hand, I don't know that I understood how deep those questions went into the political heart of the project. Yes, it's only afterwards, a bit later, that I understood that we were not just adding on Juliet Mitchell to Raymond and Marx and so on, but we were really rejigging, reconfiguring the intellectual project so that those questions became central. If you discuss the question of identity, you're discussing the question of identification, which is a process, not a thing. I took the position from the very beginning that I didn't believe in identities as stable things, because my own identity had changed. So I couldn't think it was stable. So it's clearly a position which is moving. It's a process. You identify, you think, you take up a position. That doesn't last for very long. Other things come to challenge it. You reconsider it. So I was very interested in the process of identification, but not in just the Black project, the feminist project, the X project. At that stage, well, I think we just realized that cultural studies, when it was picked up elsewhere, was going to include a range of other social interests, political positions, people from different backgrounds, and so on. The field was proliferating, yes, and was bound to, and we should welcome it. And that's in the 80s and early 90s, all the other places in Britain that started first, North East London Polytechnic started, Portsmouth Polytechnic, Middlesex started introducing cultural studies courses into their traditional fields. So it's a long route by which the cultural turn takes place. And I should add one more thing. Identification is a subjective process as well as a social one. Things are social identities, but unless you invest something in them, they don't matter. You have to invest feelings, or you have to commit to them in some way, to bear them and take the brunt of them and get sworn at because of them, really for them to matter. Otherwise they just float around and you choose to be a mod one day and a bike boy the next. So if you're interested in that deeper process, you're interested in psychoanalysis. Because psychoanalysis, as opposed to traditional sociology, has a much richer account of how identification takes place, and how identification takes place with in the social region and in language as much as just in the psyche. So the introduction of that into my own world, we're really beyond the centre. No, we're not beyond the centre, because psychoanalysis did then come in through feminism and film theory, so when I hear myself explaining this to you, it's as if something's going on out there, something real is happening in here, and this is mirroring that, and that is influencing that. So it's very hard to say, identity was my problem and I brought it into the centre. I didn't at all. I certainly didn't. Well, identity is a problem out there, which I'm reflecting. I didn't do that either. I just knew that knowledge about society and culture could not get very much further without taking on more actively both the social and the psychic and personal, subjective sides of the process.
I was going to ask about the implications that the arrival of identity politics within the centre had, though, in terms of by this point, of course, it was this notion of a loose collective, but in terms of the working relations or practices within the centre, how are they influenced by the arrival first of, I think you could argue, feminism and gender came in the mid-70s, and then with Paul, of course, I know Police in the Crisis deals with race very much, but then Paul Gilroy and his generation come along and start the race and politics.
Yes.
So how did they affect it?
There are different ways. Race, we always knew we should have dealt with race, but we couldn't recruit any bloody students before Paul's generation, because there were so few students, the black students, in higher education, doing our kind of work or taking our kind of interest, who had got good enough results in their undergraduate degrees to get money to study at an undergraduate, at the postgraduate level. So we couldn't do it. So they were not just available to us. So what you see is the moment when that cohort becomes available. Errol Lawrence, Patiba Palmer, Paul, Hazel Carby and so on. You can see it's actually a cohort, yes? We were all recruited somewhere around the same time. They become interested in the centre. It seems like a place where they can continue with their interest, and the centre becomes interested in them as a social, cultural phenomenon it ought to have at the centre of its project.
I was going to ask you more generally now about to kind of take it up to 1979, your decision to leave and take up a position at the Open University. What were the reasons behind that, and did you think that by that point the centre was safe enough for you to leave?
No, I didn't think it was. Well, by the time I left in '79, I did think it was safe enough. Just. But what had happened was that conflict of roles, which I spoke about earlier, was really becoming untenable. I couldn't manage the transition between being their director, their supervisor, their friend, their political ally, their intellectual interlocutor. It was too much for me. And I began to grow resentful. You know, I'm not adding another text that you just have thought of from French structuralism or French feminism because you heard of it. Yes? To stop tinkering with it. I'm not going to face another term or year in which we entirely revise the reading list. Come on, I've done it 5 times. This must come to a stop. It must settle somewhere. So I felt unsettled about it. And I made a very serious mistake, which showed me how untenable it was. I spoke at a conference in the States about cultural studies, and I said it's been constantly interrupted by new things. Its progress and development depends on interruptions. Whereas, normally think traditional knowledge evolves smoothly from one paradigm to another, cultural studies is broken into. And I said race and feminism have broken in to the centre in that way and reconfigured it. In other words, my attitude towards this was very positive. That was how I was warning people in the States who thought they could take up cultural studies, wouldn't create a lot of mess and problems. Just hold on. Yeah, it's not an easy subject to get hold of. But I used a metaphor. I said feminism had broken in like a thief in the night. And I used an American colloquialism, which I will not bring myself to use, which seemed to be hostile. Well, you can imagine when that news hit the centre when I returned from my time teaching in Illinois, the centre was in uproar. And women were, I of course tried to explain myself. I was aligning myself with these interruptions. I thought it was a good thing. I was trying to recommend it, speak in favour of it. But that terrible trip of the tongue was, as Freud said, betrayed more than it said. And it just told me that you are finding this very difficult. You are finding this very difficult. You've always been in favour of women's rights, more so, though it was a stormy period, gone through the identification with second wave feminism, but when it comes to authority and power, you're not as transformed as you think you are or as you ought to be. Practice is stronger than conviction in the head. I wasn't a convinced feminist because I don't believe men can be feminists. To tell you the truth, that's like a slave owner's trade union. But I believe they can understand feminism and try to change their behaviour in that direction. So I was certainly in favour of that. But somehow residues of something else were still inside me and getting expressed. And though I didn't decide to leave at that point, I thought, this is finished. It's not on. The centre needs somebody with another vision of how it hangs together, without trailing the long history that I brought into it. It needs to test whether the university will allow it to go on or not. And I didn't start to look around, but I began to think, well, what are you going to do? You can't be the head of the centre forever. So I began to look around to see where else I might go. I didn't have a problem with leaving places. I've never had a problem with leaving places. I know I've left, I'm not going to be in charge. They're going to say, we don't know what we're going to do without you. But within a term, they will know. And it'll be different from what you're wanting. So don't go back in any romantic sense and think, oh my God, where are the structures we left behind? And I didn't sort of want to go back to the centre very much. But I didn't feel, in any way affronted by the fact that it was taking its own direction. Not at all. That's what I expected. Not all of them I approved of, or was my brand of cultural studies, but, it was going to be different. Always going to be different. It became, well, no, that's not true. I was going to say it became, some part of it became closer to media studies. But that was already going in the media studies group in Birmingham, in the centre, before, well before 68. So it just changed direction. I thought that was right. It became much more theoretical. French theory zapped it from behind. I was very interested and very influenced by French theory, but I thought the notion that the centre's purpose was to develop a cultural theory was absolutely wrong. We were never about a cultural theory. We were about, developing intellectual tools for understanding the distinctive nature of culture and its relation to other practices. How culture and society, culture and economics, are related to one another. So I've never supported the idea of a cultural theory. Well, a lot of the people who took the cultural turn into theory sort of then never left it. I mean, they ventriloquized Derrida, and Levi-Strauss, and Althusser, etc. And it sounds odd for me to say so because I was very influenced by all of them. But I was influenced by them because they gave us tools to think with. Yes, tools to think with.
Do you think that sort of ethnographic, almost empirical side of the centre's work is something that gets a bit overlooked at times? I mean, Willis, Hobson...
Yes, that does happen too. And it was one of the importance of Paul Willis's work, is that, and other people who come into the centre from a different background, is that they were more attentive to the concrete. Yes, and I was always interested in using the intellectual tools to analyse the concrete. So I wanted to understand a particular conjuncture of events and relationships, but I wanted more than observation or, observers' evidence for that. I wanted some tools to break into it. Marx once said, theories concepts are like a microscope. You can't see the structure. You've got to break into it. Then you see the structure. And I wanted something which would break the carapace and reveal what was lying beneath it. So I was influenced in that way by a whole series of theories. But I didn't think producing a theory which combined them all was ever our business.
I was going to sort of end really by asking you about cultural studies today. Firstly, I was going to ask, do you think that there should be a discipline of cultural studies today? And if so, what should that discipline look like?
Well, I let you off the hook because I don't. I mean, I don't want it to be a discipline. I think its looseness is what is attractive about it. I think people find it easier to appropriate things in cultural studies and to take a kind of cultural studies path towards projects if it does not remain a discipline like every other. Now, that's easy for me to say. It becomes a discipline in many places, and the result of that is it becomes much more established, it gets funded, it makes academic appointments, it develops traditions of its own, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's one way to go. And I'm not opposed to that, but it wasn't the way that I think cultural studies should go. It did have the effect of launching cultural studies more or less globally in some funny kind of way. It was taken up in so many different places. But you know, think about Britain. Britain has a fewer cultural studies departments than almost anywhere. It never took that path. Cultural studies inserted itself into other fields. So there's cultural history, there's cultural geography, there's cultural accounting, there's Foucauldian accounting. You know, it's all over the place. And it, partly by hiding out, it's made itself tougher. It has constantly to argue against its other colleagues who don't want to attack it. Traditional historians who say we don't know what cultural history is. What's all this fuss about representations and language and nonsense. So it toughens it up. But it doesn't get anybody an annual salary. So in our own backyard, it has not become a discipline in that way. Whereas in, say, Australia, it is a discipline. In other places I can think of, in the States, well, it's become a discipline in some places, and in others not. So it hangs ambivalently between becoming a discipline in its own right, with all the problems that involves, and remaining like what I think you can plainly see from how I talk about it, as a moving target. Constantly moving target. Yeah. You want to criticize it? Come over here and read some things with me and just explain to me how that doesn't require attending to the sort of things that cultural studies is about. So it takes its place eventually in a long line of turns. Post-colonial turn, the linguistic turn, the psychoanalytic turn, finally the cultural turn.
Just finally then, do you have a message for, former friends, former colleagues at Birmingham who might have been watching this in the Muirhead Tower? Do you have a message for them watching that?
Bob Marley said, don't give up the fight. But don't expect to find the fight lodged, fully accomplished and outlined in some book. You've got to use your bloody heads. You have to use your critical faculty. You have to make intellectual use of the ideas, concepts and knowledge of the concrete studies you're doing to make some sense of it. So it's not coming already packaged. So don't think the work has been done in the first generation, the Birmingham school did it all, and we're just tagging along. Not at all, not at all. I would say something else though, which is rather new. Cultural studies worked against the grain of a certain kind of economism. The idea, eventually in classical Marxism, is that eventually ideas, are determined in the last instance by the economic. Cultural studies does not hold that position, never has held that position. It's constantly fought against a reduction of ideas to the economy. What that has meant for a lot of the period when cultural studies was operating was virtually to forget that the economy existed. So we drifted off into the cultural institutions and discourses and discursive analysis, etc., as if the economy didn't exist. And I have to say, since capitalism started, since the global capitalism started to go down the drain, everybody wants to know about economics. All the cultural studies students are talking about the labour theory of value. They all want to they've discovered what I said to you early on was the vocation of cultural studies, the role of culture in relation to or in articulation with other spheres of practice, the economy, society, the psychic. And if you go that way, you don't give in to economism, but you don't forget that there is such a thing as the economy. And if you look at a society like Britain today, almost every feature of the culture, public culture, every feature of social life. And I sometimes think every aspect of the inside of a lot of people's heads, are influenced, are shaped by by what I would call the economic, not in the narrow sense, but by the economic, by the fact that we live in a consumer society, that we live in an individualist society, that we live in a property-oriented society, and so on. So it's not just the economy, but you can't leave that dimension out. Never leave the dimension out. In one of the best definitions of cultural studies that I know, which is in the second chapter of Raymond's Long Revolution, it's kind of my early Bible, and I still stick to it. He says a very famous sentence where he says, the arts, by which I take it he means culture as well, the arts are there alongside the trading, the bringing up of families, the organization of political government, yes? And that's the notion of an articulation whole, not of one element stepping forward and saying, follow me, I'm the one determining you. In that sense, I'm an Althusserian who said, the last instance never comes. The economy never is able to push away its cultural dimensions, its linguistic influence, its psychic, its psychological, its social, never able. There is no such moment. It's always entangled in these other things which construct it as part of a social formation. And I would say to people who are thinking about using culture to understand the current crisis of global capitalism, that they should not be put off, that they're drifting back into an economic determinism. That's not what it is at all. But it requires thinking how it can influence all these things without becoming determining in the last instance. So I think that in some ways the struggle against an economistic reduction of culture and thus of cultural studies is still on the agenda.